Hello, and welcome back to a dramatic reading of His Majesty's Dragon by Naomi Novik, the first book in the Temeraire series. You know, before we begin tonight, I just want to give a shout out to one of my subscribers, Race Base, who earlier this week dropped an awesome comment on the first chapter, my reading of the first chapter of this book, saying, "Oh gosh, this is so fun to listen to. It makes me feel like a kid again, listening to a book read to me by my dad. Such an awesome experience. And such a compelling book. Please do more." And that's the kind of experience I really, really hope that you get from subscribing to the channel. And if you do, you get an alert every time your YouTube reading dad has completed another chapter for you. You'll get that notification. So hopefully you'll subscribe and hang out with us as we read through this book and many more. All right. So we are on chapter 3. Let us continue this fantastic tale. They arrived at Funchal a day short of Lawrence's original 3-week estimate, having been sped along their way by the gale, with Temeraire sitting up in the stern and eagerly watching from the moment the island had come into view. He caused something of an immediate sensation on land, dragons not ordinarily to be seen riding into harbor upon small frigates, and there was a small crowd of spectators gathered upon the docks as they came into port, although by no means coming very close to the vessel. Admiral Croft's flagship was in port. The Reliant was nominally sailing under his command, and Riley and Lawrence had privately agreed that the two of them should report together to acquaint him with the unusual situation. The signal "Captain, report aboard" flag went up on the Commendable almost the instant they had dropped anchor, meaning there's a signal saying the captain of Lawrence's ship needs to come aboard this ship that's signaling. Paused only for a moment to speak with Temeraire. "You must remain aboard until I return, remember," he said anxiously, for while Temeraire was never fully disobliging, he was easily distracted by anything new and of interest, and Lawrence did not have a great deal of confidence in his restraint while surrounded by so much of a new world to explore. "I promise you we shall fly over the whole island when I come back. You shall see all you like. And in the meantime, Mr. Wells will bring you a nice fresh veal and some lamb, which you have never had." Temeraire sighed a little, but inclined his head. "Very well, but do hurry," he said. "I would like to go up to those mountains, and I could just eat those," he added, looking at a team of carriage horses standing nearby. The horses stamped nervously, as though they had heard and understood perfectly well. "Oh, no, Temeraire, you cannot just eat anything you see on the streets," Lawrence said in alarm. "Wells will bring you something straight away." Turning, he caught the third lieutenant's eye and conveyed the urgency of the situation, and when, with a final dubious glance, he went down the gangplank and joined Riley. Admiral Croft was waiting for them impatiently. He had evidently heard something of the fuss. He was a tall man and a striking one, the more so for a raking scar across his face, and the false hand which was attached to the stump of his left arm, its iron fingers operated by springs and catches. He had lost the limb shortly before his promotion to flag rank, and since had put on a great deal of weight. He did not rise when they came into his stateroom. He only scowled a little and waved them to the chairs. "Very well, Lawrence, explain yourself. I suppose this has something to do with the feral you have down there?" "Sir, this is Temeraire. That is Temeraire. He is not feral," Lawrence said. "We took a French ship, the Amity, 3 weeks ago, yesterday. We found his egg in their hold. Our surgeon had some knowledge of dragonkind. He warned us that it would hatch shortly, so we were able to arrange, that is to say, I harnessed him." Croft sat up abruptly and squinted at Lawrence, then at Riley, only then taking notice of the change in uniform. "What? Yourself? And so you... Good Lord, why didn't you put one of your midshipmen to the thing?" he demanded. "This is taking duty a little far, Lawrence. A fine thing when a naval officer chooses to jump ship for the corps." "Sir, my officers and I drew lots," Lawrence said, suppressing a flare of indignation. He had not desired to be lauded for his sacrifice, but it was a little much to be upbraided for it. I hope no one would ever question my devotion to the service. I felt it only fair to them that I should share the risk, and in the event, though I did not draw the lot, there was no avoiding it. He took a liking to me, and we could not risk him refusing the harness from another hand.
"Oh, hell,"
Croft said, and relapsed into his chair with a sullen expression, tapping the fingers of his right hand against the metal palm of the left. A nervous gesture, and sat silently, except for the small clinking noise, clink, 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 which his fingernails made upon the iron. The minutes dragged, while Lawrence alternated between imagining 1,000 disasters which Temeraire might precipitate in his absence, and worrying what Croft might do with the Reliant and Riley. As at last Croft started, as if waking up, and then waved his good hand.
"Well, there must be some sort of bounty. They can't hardly give less for a harnessed creature than a feral one, after all," he said. "The French frigate. A man of war, I suppose? No merchantman? Well, she looks likely enough. I'm sure she'll be brought into the service," he added, good humor apparently restored,
and Lawrence realized with mingled relief and irritation that the man had only been calculating his admiral's share in his head.
"Indeed, sir, she is very trim. She is a very trim craft, 36 guns, he said politely,
keeping several other things that he might have said to himself. He would never have to report to this man again, but Riley's future still hung in the balance.
You have done right you've done as you ought, Lawrence, I'm sure, though it is a pity to lose you. I suppose you shall like to be an aviator,"
Croft said in tones that made it quite plain he supposed no such thing.
"We have no division of the corps locally, though even the dispatch carrier only comes through once a week. You shall have to take him to Gibraltar, I imagine."
"Yes, sir, though the trip must wait until he has more growth. He can stay aloft for an hour or so without much trouble, but I do not like to risk him on a long flight just yet," Lawrence said firmly. "And in the meantime he must be fed. We have only managed to get so long with fishing, but of course we cannot hunt here."
"Well, Lawrence, that is no lookout of the navies, I'm sure,"
Croft said, but before Lawrence could be really taken aback by this petty remark, the man seemed to realize how ill it sounded and amended his words.
"However, I will speak to the governor. I'm sure we can arrange something. Now then, the Reliant, and of course the Amite. We must take some thought for them."
"I should like to point out that Mr. Riley has been in command of the Reliant since the harnessing, and that he has handled her exceptionally well, bringing her safely to port through a 2 days' gale," Lawrence said. "He fought very bravely in the action which won us the prize as well."
"Oh, I'm sure,"
Croft said, turning his fingers in circles again.
"Who do you have in the Amite?"
"My first lieutenant, Gibbs," Lawrence said.
"Yes, of course,"
Croft said.
"Well, it is a bit much of you to hope to make both your first and second lieutenant's post in such a way. Lawrence, you must see that. There are not so many fine frigates out there."
Lawrence had great difficulty in keeping his countenance. The man was clearly looking for some excuse to give himself a plum to deal out to one of his own favorites. "Sir," he said icily, "I do not quite take your meaning. I hope you are not suggesting that I had myself put in harness in order to open a vacancy. I assure you my only motive was to secure to England a very valuable dragon, and I would hope that their lordships will see it in such a way." It was as close as he would come to harping on his own sacrifice, and a good deal closer than he would have preferred to come without Riley's welfare at stake. But it had its effect. Croft seemed struck by the reminder, and the mention of the Admiralty. At least he hemmed and hawed and retreated. At least he hemmed and hawed and retreated, and then dismissed them without saying anything final about removing Riley from command. "Sir, I'm deeply indebted to you," Riley said, as they walked together back towards the ship. "I only hope that you will not have caused difficulties for yourself by pressing the matter so. I suppose you must have a great deal of influence." Lawrence at the moment had little room for any emotion but relief, for they had come to their own dock, and Temeraire was still sitting on the deck of the ship, although it looked more like an abattoir at the moment, and the area around his chops more red than black. The word abattoir is like a place where meat is cut and chopped up and animals are like slaughtered, so it would be a bloody place. The crowd of spectators had entirely dispersed. If there is any blessing in this whole business, Tom, it is that I no longer need to give much thought to influence. I do not suppose it can make any difference to an aviator, he answered. Pray have no concern for me. Should you mind if I were to walk a little faster? I think he has finished eating. Flying did a great deal more to soothe... Oh, finished eating. Next scene. They go to bed. Next scene. Flying did a great deal more to soothe his ruffled temper. It was impossible to be angry with the whole island of Madeira spread out before him. Oh, and by the way, I'd said in a previous recording that Madeira is in Spain. I'm almost positive that Madeira is in Portugal, and Portugal was an ally of England during the time of the Napoleonic War, and Spain was an ally of France. So I got to think Madeira is in Portugal. And I could easily look it up. Somebody look it up, drop a comment. Anyway, the whole island of Madeira spread out before him, and the wind in his hair. And Temeraire excitedly pointing out new things of interest, such as animals, horses, carts, trees, rocks, and anything else which might catch his eye. He had lately worked out a method of flying with his head partly turned around, so that he might talk to Lawrence even while they flew. By mutual agreement, he perched at last upon an empty road that ran along the edge of a deep valley. A bank of clouds was rolling thickly down the green southern slopes, clinging to the ground in a peculiar way, and he sat to watch their movement in fascination. Lawrence dismounted. He was still growing used to riding, and was glad to stretch his legs after an hour in the air. He walked about for a while now, enjoying the view, and thought to himself that the next morning he would bring something to eat and drink on their flight. He would rather like to have a sandwich and a glass of wine. Getting comfortable up there, Lawrence. I would like another one of those lambs, Temeraire said, echoing his own thoughts. They were very tasty. Can I eat those over there? They look even larger. There was a handsome flock of sheep grazing placidly on the far side of the valley, white against the green. No, Temeraire, those are sheep. Mutton, Lawrence said. They are not as good, and I think they must be someone's property, so we cannot go snatching them. But perhaps I will see if I cannot arrange for the shepherd to set one aside for you tomorrow, if you would like to come back here. It seems very strange that the ocean is full of things that one can eat as one likes, and on land everything seems to be spoken for, Temeraire said, disappointed. It does not seem quite right. They are not eating those sheep themselves, after all, and I am hungry now. At this rate, I suppose I shall be arrested for teaching you seditious thinking, Lawrence said, amused. You sound positively revolutionary. Only think, perhaps the fellow who owns those is the same one who we will ask to give us a nice lamb for your dinner tonight. He will hardly do so if we steal his sheep. I would rather have a nice lamb now, Temeraire muttered, but he did not go after one of the sheep, and instead returned to examining the clouds. May we go over to those clouds? I would like to see why they are moving like that. Lawrence looked at the shrouded hillside dubiously, but he more and more disliked telling the dragon no when he did not have to. I know how that feels when you've got children or loved ones. It was so often necessary. We may try it if you like, he said, but it seems a little risky. We could easily run up against the mountainside and be brought by the lee. Oh, I will land below them, and then we may walk up, Temeraire said, crouching low and putting his neck to the ground so Lawrence could scramble back aboard. That will be more interesting in any case. It was a little odd to go walking with a dragon, and very odd to outdistance one. Temeraire might take one step to every 10 paces of Lawrence's, but he took them very rarely,
being more occupied in looking back and forth to compare the degree of cloud cover upon the ground. Lawrence finally walked some distance ahead and threw himself down the slope to wait. Even under the heavy fog, he was comfortable, thanks to the heavy clothing and oilskin cloak which he had learned from experience to wear while flying. Temeraire continued to creep very slowly up the hill, interrupting his studies of the clouds now and again to look at a flower or a pebble. To Lawrence's surprise, he paused at one point and dug a small rock out of the ground, which he then brought up to Lawrence with apparent excitement. Pushing it along the tip of a talon, as it was too small for him to pick up in his claws, Lawrence hefted the thing, which was about the size of his fist. It certainly was curious. Pyrite intergrown with quartz crystal and rock. "How did you come to see it?" he asked with interest, turning it over in his hands and brushing away more of the dirt. "A little of it was out of the ground, and it was shining," Temeraire said. "Is that gold? I like the look of it." "No, it is just pyrite, but it is very pretty, is it not? I suppose you are one of those hoarding creatures," Lawrence said, looking affectionately up at Temeraire. Many dragons had an inborn fascination with jewels or precious metals. "I'm afraid I'm not rich enough of a partner for you. I will not be able to give you a heap of gold to sleep on." "I would rather have you than a heap of gold, even if it were very comfortable to sleep on," Temeraire said. "I do not mind the deck." He said it quite normally, not in the least as though he meant to deliver a compliment, and immediately went back to looking at his clouds. Lawrence was left gazing after him in a sensation of mingled amazement and extraordinary pleasure. It is amazing when a loved one pays you an unexpected compliment, something that you feel that you've been focusing for a long time to maybe earn from them, and it just kind of blurts out like that, and you find out where you stand with someone. That's pretty cool. Mingled amazement, extraordinary pleasure. He could scarcely imagine a similar feeling. The only parallel he could conceive from in his old life would be if the Reliant had spoken to say she liked to have him for her captain. Both praise and affection from the highest source imaginable, and it filled him with fresh determination to prove worthy of the encomium. Encomium, I think, is another word for sort of compliment or word of praise. Next scene. "I'm afraid I cannot help you, sir," the old fellow said, scratching behind his ears. He straightened up from the heavy volume before him. "I have a dozen books of draconic breeds, and I cannot find him in any of them. Perhaps his coloration will change when he gets older." Lawrence frowned. This was the third naturalist he had consulted over the past week since landing in Madeira, and none of them had been able to give him any help whatsoever in determining Temeraire's breed. "However," the bookseller went on, "I can give you some hope. Sir Edward Howe of the Royal Society is here on the island, taking the waters. He came by my shop last week. I believe he's staying in Porto Monitz, at the northern end of the island, and I'm sure he'll be able to identify your dragon for you. He has written several monographs on rare breeds of the Americas and the Orient." "Thank you very much indeed. I'm glad to hear it," Lawrence said, brightening at this news. The name was familiar to him, and he had met the man in London once or twice, so that he need not even scramble for an introduction. He went back out into the street in good humor, with a fine map of the island and a book of mineralogy for Temeraire. The day was particularly fine, and the dragon was presently sprawled out in a field which had been set aside for him some distance outside the city, sunning himself after a large meal. The governor had been more accommodating than Admiral Croft, perhaps due to the anxiety of his populace over the presence of a frequently hungry dragon in the middle of their port, and had opened the public treasury to provide Temeraire with a steady supply of sheep and cattle. Temeraire was not at all unhappy with the change in diet, and he was continuing to grow. He would no longer have fit on Reliant's stern, and he was bidding fair to become longer than the ship itself. Lawrence had taken a cottage beside the field at small expense due to its owner's sudden eagerness to be nowhere nearby, and the two of them were managing quite happily. He regretted his own final removal from the ship's life when he had time to think of it, but keeping Temeraire excited
exercise was a great deal of work, and he could always go into town for his dinner. He often met Riley and some of his other officers, too. He had other naval acquaintances in the town, so he rarely passed a solitary evening. The nights were comfortable as well, and even though he was obliged to return to the cottage early due to the distance, he had found a local servant, for now, who, although wholly unsmiling and taciturn, that's like very serious, was not disturbed by the dragon and could prepare a reasonable breakfast and dinner. Temeraire generally slept during the heat of the day, while he was gone, and woke again after the sun had set. After supper, Lawrence would go to sit outside and read to him by the light of a lantern. He had never been much of a reader himself, but Temeraire's pleasure in books was so great as to be infectious, and Lawrence could not but think with satisfaction of the dragon's likely delight in the new book, which spoke in great detail about gemstones and their mining. Despite his own complete lack of interest in the subject, it was not the sort of life which he had ever expected to lead, but so far, at least, he had not suffered in any material way from his change of status, and Temeraire was developing into uncommonly good company. Lawrence stopped at a coffee house and wrote Sir Edward a quick note with his direction, briefly explaining his circumstances and asking for permission to call. This was addressed to Porto Munitz and then sent off with the establishment's postboy, adding half a crown to speed it along. He could have flown across the island much more quickly, of course, but he did not feel he could simply descend upon someone with no warning, with a dragon in tow. He could wait. He still had at least a week of liberty left to him before a reply would come from Gibraltar with instructions on how to report for duty. But the dispatch rider was due tomorrow, and the thought recalled him to an omitted duty. He had not yet written to his father. He could not let his parents learn of his altered circumstances from some second-hand account, or in the Gazette notice, which would surely be printed, and with a sense of reluctant obligation, he settled himself back down with a fresh pot of coffee to write the necessary letter. It was difficult to think what to say. Lord Allendale was not a particularly fond parent, and was punctilious in his manners. The army and navy he thought barely acceptable alternatives to the church for an impoverished younger son. He would have no more considered sending a son to the corps than to a trade, something like a mason or something like that. And he would certainly neither sympathize nor approve. Because Lawrence is kind of like from a nobler family. So apparently England does not think highly of the aerial corps, these pilots, because they have to live this sort of vagabond lifestyle out with these dragons. Their bond is so close with these wild but brilliant creatures. So Lawrence was well aware that he and his father disagreed on the score of duty. His father would certainly tell him it had been his duty to his name to stay well away from the dragon, and to leave some misguided idea of service out of the matter. His mother's reaction he dreaded more, for she had real affection for him, and the news would make her unhappy for his sake. Then also she was friendly with Lady Gallman, and what he wrote would certainly reach Edith's ears. But he could not write in such terms as might reassure either of them without provoking his father extremely. So he contented himself with a stilted, formal note that laid out the facts without embellishment, that means, overdoing of details, and avoided all appearance of complaint. It would have to do. Still, he sealed it with a sense of dissatisfaction before carrying it to the dispatch post by hand. This unpleasant task completed, he turned back for the hotel in which he had taken a room. He had invited Riley and Gibbs, along with several other acquaintances, to join him for dinner, in recompense of earlier hospitality from them. It was not yet 2:00, and the shops were still open. He looked in the windows as he walked to distract himself from brooding upon the likely reaction of his family and nearest friends, and paused outside a small pawnbroker's. The golden chain was absurdly heavy, the sort of thing no woman could wear, and too gaudy for a man. Thick, square links and flat discs, and with small pearl drops hanging from them, alternated. but for the metal and the gems alone, he imagined it must be expensive, but likely far more than he should spend. For he was being cautious with his funds now that he had no future prospect of prize money. He stepped inside anyway and inquired. It was indeed too dear. "However, sir, perhaps this one would do," the proprietor suggested, offering a different chain. It looked very much the same, only with no discs, and perhaps slightly thinner links. It was nearly half the price of the first. Still expensive, but he took it, and then felt a little silly for it. He gave it to Temeraire that night anyway, and was a little surprised at the happiness with which it was received. Temeraire clutched the chain and would not put it aside. He brooded over it in the candlelight while Lawrence read to him. I mean, it's pretty adorable, even though it's like a fantasy story. It's just an adorable scene to imagine. This dragon just so pleased with a gift from a human. Would not put it aside, or the candle Lawrence read to him, and turned it this way and that to admire the light upon the gold and the pearls. When he slept at last, it remained entwined with his talons. The next day, Lawrence was obliged to attach it securely to the harness before Temeraire would consent to fly. The curious reaction made him even more glad to find an enthusiastic invitation from Sir Edward awaiting him when they returned from their flight that morning. Fernau brought the note out to him in the field when they landed, and Lawrence read it aloud to Temeraire. The gentleman would receive them whenever they liked to come, and he could be found at the seashore near the bathing pools. "I am not tired," Temeraire said. He was curious to know his breed as Lawrence. He was as curious to learn his breed as Lawrence was. "We may go at once, if you like." He had indeed been developing more and more endurance. Lawrence decided that they could easily stop and rest if needed, and climbed back aboard without even having shifted his clothing. Temeraire put out an unusual effort, and the island whipped by in great sweeps of his wings. Lawrence crouched low to his neck and squinted against the wind because they're going so fast. They spiraled down to the shore less than an hour after lifting away, scattering bathers and seashore vendors as they landed upon the rocky shore. Lawrence gazed after them in dismay for a moment, then frowned. If they were foolish enough to imagine that a properly harnessed dragon could hurt them, it would be hardly his fault, and he patted Temeraire's neck as he unstrapped himself and slid down.
"I will go and see if I can find Sir Edward. Stay here."
"I will," said Temeraire absently. He was already peering with interest into the deep rocky pools about the shore, which had odd stone outcroppings and with very clear water. Sir Edward did not prove very difficult to find. He had noticed the fleeing crowd and was already approaching, the only person in view by the time Temeraire had gone a quarter of a mile. They shook hands and exchanged pleasantries, but both of them were impatient to come to the real matter of hand, and Sir Edward assented eagerly as soon as Lawrence ventured to suggest that they should walk back to Temeraire. "A most unusual and charming name," Sir Edward said, as they walked, unconsciously making Lawrence's heart sink. "Most often they're given Roman names, extravagant ones, but then most aviators go into harness a great deal younger than you, and have a tendency to puff themselves up. There is something quite absurd about a 2-ton Winchester called Imperatorius. Why, Lawrence, however did you teach him to swim?" Startled, Lawrence looked, then stared. In his absence, Temeraire had gone into the water and was now paddling himself about.
"Lord, no, I've never seen him do it before," he said. "How can he not be sinking? Temeraire, do come out of the water," he called, a little anxious. Sir Edward watched with interest as Temeraire swam towards them and climbed back up onto shore. "How extraordinary! The internal air sacs which permit how extraordinary! The internal air sacs which permit them to fly around, I imagine, make a dragon naturally buoyant. And having grown up on the ocean as he has, perhaps he has no real natural fear of the element." This mention of air sacs was a piece of new information to Lawrence, but the dragon was joining them, and so he saved further questions that immediately sprang to mind. "Temeraire, this is Sir Edward Howe," Lawrence said.
"Hello," said Temeraire, peering down with interest equal to that with which he was observed. "I am very pleased to meet you. Can you tell me what breed I am?" Sir Edward did not seem nonplussed by this direct approach, and he made a bow in reply. "I hope I will be able to give you some information, indeed. May I ask you to be so kind as to move some distance up the shore, perhaps by that tree, which you see over there, and spread your wings, so we may better see your full confirmation?" Confirmation. See your full confirmation, yeah. Temeraire went willingly, and Sir Edward observed his motion. Very odd. Not characteristic at all. The way he holds his tail. Lawrence, you say his egg was found in Brazil?
"As to that I cannot properly tell you, I'm afraid," Lawrence said, studying Temeraire's tail.
He could see nothing unusual, but of course he had no real basis of comparison. Temeraire carried his tail off the ground, and it lashed the air gently as he walked.
"We took him from a French prize, and she was most recently come from Rio, judging by the markings on some of her water casks, but more than that I cannot say. The logs were thrown overboard as we took her, and the captain very naturally refused to give us any information about where the egg was discovered. But I assume it could not have come from much further, due to the length of the journey."
"Oh, that is by no means certain," Sir Edward said. "There are some subjects which mature in the shell for upwards of 10 years, and 20 months is a common average. Good Lord!" Temeraire had just spread out his wings. They were still dripping with water.
"Yes?" Lawrence asked hopefully.
"Lawrence, my God, those wings!" Sir Edward cried, and literally ran across the shore towards Temeraire. Lawrence blinked and went after him, and caught up to him only by the dragon's side. Must be something special about what he's seeing there. Sir Edward was gently stroking one of the 6 spines that divided the sections of Temeraire's wings, gazing at it with greedy passion. Temeraire had craned his head about to watch, and was keeping otherwise still, and did not seem to mind having his wing handled.
"Do you recognize him, then?" Lawrence asked Sir Edward tentatively.
The man looked quite overwhelmed. "Recognize? Not, I assure you, in the sense of ever having seen this kind before. There could scarcely be 3 living men in Europe who have. And on the strength of this one glance, I am already furnished with enough material for an address to the Royal Society," Sir Edward answered. "But the wings are irrefutable, and the number of talons. He is a Chinese imperial, although of which line I cannot tell you. Oh, Lawrence, what a prize!" Lawrence gazed at the wings, bemused. It had not occurred to him before that the fan-like divisions were unusual, nor the 5 talons which Temeraire had upon each foot.
"An imperial?"
he said, with an uncertain smile. He wondered for a moment if Sir Edward was practicing a joke on him. The Chinese had been breeding dragons for thousands of years before the Romans had ever domesticated the wild breeds of Europe. So there's another little altered history here, working dragons in to familiar civilizations. They were violently jealous of their work and rarely permitted even the... Oh no, this is just dialogue. This is just narration. They were violently jealous of their work and rarely permitted even grown specimens of minor breeds to leave the country. It was absurd to think that the French had been trundling an imperial egg across the Atlantic in a 36-gun frigate. "Is that a good breed?" Temeraire asked. "Will I be able to breathe fire?" "Dear creature, the very best of all possible breeds. Only the Celestials are more rare or valuable, and were you one of those, I suppose, the Chinese would go to war over our having put you into harness. So we must be glad that you are not," Sir Edward said. "But though I will not rule it out entirely, I think it unlikely you will be able to breathe fire. The Chinese breed first for intelligence and grace, and they have such overwhelming air superiority, they do not need to seek such abilities in their lines. Japanese dragons are far more likely among the Oriental breeds to have any special offensive capabilities." "Oh," said Temeraire glumly.
"Temeraire, do not be absurd. It is the most famous news anyone could imagine," Lawrence said, beginning to believe at last that this was too far to carry a joke.
"You are quite certain, sir?" he asked. He could not help asking.
"Oh, yes,"
Sir Edward said, returning to his examination of the wings.
Only look at the delicacy of the membrane, the consistency of the color throughout the body, and the coordination between the color of the eyes and the markings. I should have seen he was a Chinese breed at once. It is quite impossible that he should have come from the wild, and no European or Incan breeder is capable of such work. And, he added, this explains the swimming as well. Chinese beasts often have an affinity for water, if I recall correctly. An imperial, Lawrence murmured, stroking Temerair's side in wonder. It is incredible. They ought to have conveyed him with half their fleet, or sent a handler to him rather than the service. Or sent a handler to him rather than the reverse. Or sent a handler to him rather than the reverse. Perhaps they did not know what they had, Sir Edward said. Chinese eggs are notoriously difficult to categorize by appearance, other than having the texture of fine porcelain. I do not suppose, by the by, that you have any of the eggshell preserved? He asked wistfully. Not I, but perhaps some of the hands may have saved a bit, Lawrence said. I would be happy to make an inquiry for you. I am deeply indebted to you. Not at all. The debt is entirely on my side. To think that I have seen an imperial, and spoken with one. He bowed to Temeraire. In that, I may be unique among Englishmen, although Le Comte de la Pérouse wrote in his journals of having spoken with one in Korea, in the palace of their king. I would like to read that, Temeraire said. Lawrence, can you get a copy? I will certainly try, Lawrence said. And, sir, I'd be very grateful if you could recommend some texts to my attention. I would be glad of any knowledge of the habits and the behaviors of the breed. Well, there are precious few resources, I am afraid. You will shortly be more of an expert than any other European, I imagine, Sir Edward said. But I would certainly give you a list, and I have several texts I would be happy to lend you, including the journals of La Pérouse. If Temeraire does not mind waiting here, perhaps we can walk back to my hotel and retrieve them. I'm afraid he would not fit very comfortably in the village. I do not mind at all. I will go swimming again, Temeraire said. All right, we're going to pause there. The chapters in this book are pretty hefty, so I don't want the session to get too long on you. But we will pick back up on the back half of Chapter 3 here. And once again, if you subscribe, you get an instant alert about that. And we'll keep a chapter coming every week until the book is finished. That's what we do over here. Thanks again for all your comments and your support. I hope you enjoy it. I'm doing this for my kids and for the young at heart. And thanks for reading with me. We'll see you on the next one.